The exhaustion nobody talks about. Have you ever spent an entire day doing almost nothing physically and yet felt completely exhausted? Not the kind of exhaustion that comes from hard work, not the kind that sleep immediately fixes, but a deeper fatigue, a strange heaviness, a feeling that something inside you has been drained. Many people experience this after social interactions, a family gathering, a visit from a friend, a long phone call, an afternoon spent entertaining guests. Nothing terrible happened. No arguments. No conflict. Everyone was pleasant. Everyone was kind. And yet, when it's over, all you want is silence. You close the door. You sit down. And for the first time all day, you can breathe. If you've ever experienced this, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And for years, many people interpret this feeling the wrong way. They tell themselves, maybe I'm antisocial. Maybe I'm becoming cold. Maybe I don't like people. But according to Carl Jung, the truth may be something entirely different, because not all exhaustion comes from activity. Some exhaustion comes from disconnection from yourself. Modern society teaches us that constant availability is the virtue. Answer the messages, attend the event, make the call, say yes, show up, be present, be social, be engaged. But what happens when your soul needs something else? What happens when your deepest psychological need is not more stimulation, but less? Jung observed something fascinating about human nature. He realized that people are energized in fundamentally different ways. Some people naturally move toward the external world. They thrive in conversation. They gain energy through interaction. They feel alive when surrounded by activity. But others operate differently. Their energy moves inward. They reconnect with themselves through reflection, through solitude, through silence, through moments where nothing is demanded of them. And when these individuals spend too much time engaged with the outer world, something begins to happen. Their internal resources slowly deplete, not because they dislike people, not because they're selfish, but because their psyche has a different rhythm. Imagine a lake. When the surface is constantly disturbed, it becomes impossible to see beneath it. The water remains agitated, clouded, restless. But when the wind stops, when everything becomes still, the lake begins to reveal its depth. Your mind works the same way. There are insights that only emerge in silence, answers that only appear in solitude, parts of yourself that can only be heard when the noise finally fades. This is why some people feel an almost physical need to be alone after social interaction. Their psyche is trying to return to equilibrium, trying to settle the waters, trying to hear itself again. Unfortunately, society often misunderstands this. If you enjoy being around people all the time, nobody questions you. But if you enjoy being alone, people become concerned. They ask questions. They assume something is wrong. They tell you to get out more, to be more social, to stop isolating yourself. And after hearing these messages for years, many people begin to distrust their own nature. They start forcing themselves into situations that leave them exhausted. They ignore the signals coming from within. They betray their own energy. And eventually, they wonder why they feel constantly drained. Jung would likely say that the problem is not your need for solitude. The problem is your refusal to listen to it. Because every psyche has its own language. And one of the ways the psyche speaks is through exhaustion. Exhaustion is often not a punishment. It is information, a message, a signal. Your inner world communicating that something is out of balance. Think about the moments when you feel most alive, most peaceful, most connected to yourself. For many people, those moments don't happen in crowded rooms. They happen in quiet ones. Reading alone, walking alone, sitting in silence, watching the rain, drinking coffee before the world wakes up, looking out a window. Without any need to be productive, these moments may seem insignificant, but psychologically, they are incredibly important because during these moments, you stop performing, you stop adapting, you stop responding to expectations, and for a brief period of time, you simply exist. Many people have forgotten how powerful that is, to simply exist, without proving anything, without entertaining anyone, without explaining yourself, without being needed, just you and your own presence. Carl Jung believed that the path towards psychological wholeness begins when we stop living according to external expectations and start listening to our inner reality. Yet, that is precisely what many people are afraid to do, because listening inward requires silence, and silence can be uncomfortable. Silence removes distractions. Silence reveals truths. Silence confronts us with ourselves. That is why some people unconsciously stay busy all the time, not because they enjoy activity, but because they fear what they might discover in stillness. Yet for others, stillness feels like home, not because they have all the answers, but because their soul recognizes something there, something familiar, something healing. And if you are someone who feels drained by constant interaction, if you find yourself secretly hoping plans get canceled, if you feel relief when visitors leave, perhaps there is nothing wrong with you. Perhaps your psyche is simply asking for something essential. Space, not isolation, not loneliness. Space. Space to breathe, space to think, space to reconnect with yourself. Because before you can genuinely connect with others, you must first remain connected to who you are, and that connection is often rebuilt in silence, not in crowds, not in noise, not in constant stimulation, but in the quiet moments most people overlook, the moments when the door closes, the world becomes still, and you finally hear the voice you've been missing all day, your own. Why your home feels sacred. There's a reason why some people can spend hours in crowded places and feel perfectly fine. Yet the moment someone enters their home unexpectedly, something changes. A subtle tension appears. Not fear, not anger, just a feeling that something deeply personal has been disturbed. If you've ever experienced this, you know how difficult it can be to explain. After all, it sounds irrational. It's just a visitor, a friend, a relative, someone who means well. So why does it feel like such a big deal? Carl Jung might answer that question in a way most people would never expect. Because according to Jung, a house is never just a house. To the unconscious mind, a house is a symbol. And symbols speak a language far older than logic. Throughout Jung's work, dreams involving houses appeared again and again. People dreamed of forgotten rooms, hidden basements, locked doors, ancient staircases, attics filled with mysterious objects. And Jung noticed something fascinating. The house almost always represented the psyche itself, the inner world, the totality of the self, the structure of the soul. This means that when you think about your home, your unconscious may experience it as much more than a physical location. It becomes an extension of who you are, a reflection of your inner reality. Think about it. When life becomes overwhelming, where do you want to go? Home. When you're exhausted, where do you retreat? Home. When you're emotionally wounded, where do you seek comfort? Home. This is not an accident. The psyche naturally associates home with safety, with restoration, with belonging. Your home becomes a psychological sanctuary, a place where your nervous system relaxes, a place where your defenses soften, a place where you no longer need to perform. And that is exactly why unwanted interruptions feel so powerful. Because when someone enters your home, they are entering the one place where you expected complete freedom. For some people, this isn't a problem. Their energy naturally expands outward. But for sensitive individuals, for introverts, for deep thinkers, for people engaged in inner growth, the experience can feel entirely different. Imagine spending an entire day carrying invisible weights, responsibilities, expectations, conversations, deadlines, emotional labor, then finally arriving at the one place where you can set those weights down. Your home, your refuge, your sanctuary. And just as your nervous system begins to relax, the phone rings, the doorbell sounds. Someone wants your attention again. Immediately, your mind shifts, your energy changes, your body becomes alert, not because you're rude, but because the sanctuary is no longer entirely yours. Jung understood that the unconscious reacts strongly to boundaries, and the front door is one of the most powerful boundaries we experience. Symbolically, it separates two worlds, the outer world and the inner world, the world of expectations and the world of authenticity. When someone crosses that threshold, Your psyche often reacts long before your conscious mind does. This is why you may feel discomfort without knowing exactly why. The feeling appears before the explanation. The emotion arrives before the logic, and many people mistakenly judge themselves for it. They think, why am I like this? Why can't I just relax? Why does this bother me so much? But perhaps the better question is, what is this feeling trying to protect? Because psychological discomfort often serves a purpose. Sometimes it exists to alert you when something valuable is being threatened. And what could be more valuable than your inner peace? Modern culture often encourages constant accessibility. Answer immediately. Respond immediately. Be available. Be reachable. Be present. Always. But the soul doesn't function like a smartphone. It requires periods of withdrawal, periods of restoration, periods where nothing is demanded. Your home often becomes a physical container for those periods, a sacred space where your psyche reorganizes itself, where emotions settle, where thoughts become clear, where identity reconnects with itself. And this is especially important during times of transformation. Carl Jung spent much of his life studying a process he called individuation, the journey of becoming who you truly are, not who others expect you to be, not who society rewards, but who you genuinely are beneath every mask. And one of the most surprising discoveries Jung made was this. Individuation often requires solitude, not permanent isolation, not disconnection, but periods of sacred withdrawal, moments where external voices become quiet enough for the inner voice to be heard. Unfortunately, that voice is often very soft. It cannot compete with endless conversations, constant stimulation, social obligations, or the pressure to always be available. It needs silence. It needs stillness. It needs space. This may be why your home feels so important to you, not because of the furniture, not because of the walls, not because of the address, but because your unconscious recognizes it as a place where your true self can emerge, a place where you can stop performing, a place where you can finally exhale. And perhaps that is why unexpected visitors sometimes feel so disruptive, not because they are doing anything wrong, but because they unintentionally interrupt a process your soul desperately needs, the process of returning to yourself. There is another reason this matters. Many people spend years ignoring their need for personal space. They tell themselves they should be more social, more available, more accommodating. So they say yes when they want to say no. They open the door when they need solitude. They sacrifice their peace to avoid disappointing others. At first, this seems harmless. But over time, something begins to happen. Resentment grows. Exhaustion deepens. Authenticity disappears. The soul begins to feel crowded. And eventually, people find themselves wondering why they feel disconnected from life. The answer may be simpler than they realize. They stop protecting the places where their spirit could breathe. Jung believed that psychological health depends upon honoring the needs of the self, not the expectations of others. The needs of the self. And for many people, one of those needs is space. Sacred space. Personal space. Emotional space. The kind of space that allows you to hear your own thoughts again. The kind of space that allows your nervous system to settle. The kind of space that reminds you who you are when nobody else is around. If that resonates with you, if your home feels less like a building and more like a sanctuary, then perhaps your discomfort with visitors is not a weakness. Perhaps it is an instinct, a healthy instinct, a signal from your psyche reminding you that some places deserve protection, not because you hate people, but because you value peace. And peace, once lost, is often much harder to recover than most people realize. The hidden cost of wearing a mask. Have you ever noticed something strange? Sometimes a visit goes perfectly well. Nobody argues. Nobody disrespects you. The conversation is pleasant. The atmosphere is friendly. Everything appears normal. And yet, the moment the visitor leaves, you feel exhausted, not physically tired, something deeper, as if all your energy has been quietly drained. You sit down on the couch. The silence returns. And suddenly you feel relief, not because the person was bad, not because you dislike them, but because you can finally stop being on. Many people experience this and immediately feel guilty. They think, what's wrong with me? They were nice. I should have enjoyed it. But Carl Jung would suggest that something much deeper is happening, something almost invisible, something he called the persona. And understanding the persona may completely change the way you see yourself. Because according to Jung, every human being wears a psychological mask, not a physical mask, a social one, a carefully constructed version of ourselves designed to function in society. The persona is the face we present to the world. It helps us fit in. It helps us communicate. It helps us navigate relationships. Without it, social life would be almost impossible. The persona is not bad. In fact, it is necessary. The problem begins when we spend too much time wearing it, especially when we forget that it is only a mask. Imagine an actor. The actor steps onto a stage, performs brilliantly, delivers every line perfectly, receives applause, then returns backstage. Now imagine if that actor never left the stage, never removed the costume, never stopped performing. Eventually, exhaustion would become unavoidable. That is exactly what happens psychologically. Many people spend their entire lives performing, at work, at family gatherings, at social events, on social media, even inside their own homes, always adjusting, always adapting, always managing impressions, always trying to be acceptable, and over time, they lose contact with something essential, their authentic self. Jung warned about this repeatedly. He believed that modern people often become trapped inside their persona. They become so identified with the image they present that they no longer know who they are underneath it. And nowhere is this tension felt more strongly than at home, because home is supposed to be the one place where the mask can finally come off. Think about your own experience. When you're alone, how do you sit? How do you speak? How do you move? How do you spend your time? Now compare that version of yourself to the one that appears when someone visits unexpectedly. Immediately, things change. You become more aware, more careful, more attentive. You monitor your words. You monitor your expressions. You think about how you're being perceived. Even subtle things consume energy. Should I offer coffee? Should I keep the conversation going? Am I being polite enough? Do they feel welcome? Should I smile more? Should I seem interested? Most of this happens unconsciously. You don't notice it, but your psyche does. And every adjustment requires energy, psychic energy, the very energy introverted and sensitive people work so hard to protect. This is why a 2-hour visit can sometimes feel more exhausting than a full day of work, not because the interaction was negative, but because maintaining the persona is costly, especially for people who naturally live closer to their inner world. Jung observed that introverts often experience this tension more intensely, not because they dislike people, but because their energy naturally flows inward. Their psychological center of gravity exists within. Every extended social interaction pulls that energy outward, again and again and again, until eventually the system needs recovery. This recovery is not selfishness. It is maintenance, the same way sleep restores the body. Solitude restores the psyche. Unfortunately, society often misunderstands this. People praise extroversion, constant engagement, constant availability, constant enthusiasm. And because of this, many introverts grow up believing something is wrong with them. They force themselves to socialize. They force themselves to entertain. They force themselves to remain available, even when every part of their being is asking for rest. The result? Chronic exhaustion, emotional burnout, resentment, and a growing sense of disconnection from themselves. Jung understood this danger. He believed the soul communicates through discomfort, through tension, through fatigue, through resistance. These feelings are not always problems to eliminate. Sometimes they are messages from the deeper self. And perhaps your exhaustion after visitors is one of those messages. Perhaps your psyche is saying, you have been performing for too long. You need to return to yourself. You need space. You need authenticity. There's another aspect of the persona that few people talk about. The more agreeable you are, the more responsible you are, the more empathetic you are, the stronger your persona often becomes, because you become highly skilled at meeting the emotional expectations of others. You become the listener, the helper, the peacemaker, the reliable one, the accommodating one. And while these qualities are beautiful, they can become dangerous when they are not balanced, because eventually you stop asking a crucial question: what do I need? Instead, you constantly ask, what do they need? And every visitor activates that habit. Without realizing it, you begin serving, hosting, managing, supporting, accommodating, even if nobody asked you to, even if nobody expects it. The persona automatically takes over. And afterward, you wonder why you're so tired. The answer is simple. You weren't just spending time with another person. You were carrying a role, and roles are heavy. This is why solitude feels so healing afterward, because when the door closes, the role ends, the performance ends, the monitoring ends, the adjustments end, and suddenly you can breathe again. You can sit however you want, think whatever you want, feel whatever you want. You can simply exist. No audience, no expectations, no performance, just you. For Jung, this state was profoundly important, because authenticity is impossible without moments of genuine solitude. How can you know who you truly are if you never spend time alone with yourself? How can you hear your inner voice if external voices are always present? How can you discover your true nature if you're constantly adapting to everyone around you? These questions become increasingly important as we grow older, because eventually life presents us with a choice: continue performing, or begin becoming; continue pleasing, or begin listening; continue wearing the mask, or slowly learn who lives behind it. And perhaps this is why certain people guard their homes so carefully, because deep down, they understand something most people never realize. The home is not merely a shelter for body. It is a sanctuary for the self, a place where the mask can finally fall, a place where authenticity becomes possible, a place where the soul can rest. And once you understand that, your need for solitude no longer feels like a flaw. It begins to look like wisdom. Why your soul craves silence. What if your desire to be alone isn't a weakness? What if it isn't avoidance? What if it isn't fear? What if the very thing you've been judging about yourself is actually one of the most important psychological instincts you possess? Most people spend their lives trying to escape silence. The moment silence appears, they reach for something: a phone, a television, a conversation, a notification, a distraction, anything to avoid being alone with their own thoughts. And yet, Carl Jung believed something radically different. He believed that silence is not empty. Silence is where the soul speaks. The problem is that the soul rarely shouts. It whispers, and those whispers become impossible to hear when life is constantly noisy. Think about the moments that changed your life, not the moments that entertained you, the moments that transformed you, the moments that forced you to see yourself differently, the moments that revealed a truth you could no longer ignore. Most likely, those moments did not happen in a crowded room. They happened in silence, alone, late at night, during a walk, while staring out a window, while sitting with a feeling you could no longer avoid. This is why Jung placed such importance on solitude, because solitude creates the conditions necessary for transformation, and transformation is impossible without self-awareness. The challenge is that self-awareness is not always comfortable. When external distractions disappear, something else appears: your inner world. And that inner world contains everything: your dreams, your fears, your regrets, your desires, your wounds, your untapped potential, the parts of yourself you've embraced, and the parts you spent years avoiding. This is why many people unconsciously fear solitude, because silence removes the escape routes. Suddenly, there is nowhere to run, no conversation to hide behind, no entertainment to numb the discomfort, no visitor to distract you from yourself, only you. And for many people, that is terrifying. But Jung saw this confrontation differently. He believed it was essential, because according to Jung, the goal of life is not simply survival. It is individuation. the process of becoming fully yourself, not the self others expect, not the self you've been conditioned to be, but the self that exists beneath all expectations, beneath all conditioning, beneath all masks. Individuation is not a destination. It is a lifelong journey, and every meaningful journey requires periods of withdrawal. Imagine trying to hear a quiet melody while standing beside a jet engine. Impossible. That melody represents your authentic self. The noise represents the demands of the world, the opinions, the expectations, the pressures, the comparisons, the obligations, the endless stream of external influences telling you who you should be. Jung understood that if you never step away from that noise, you may spend your entire life becoming what others want instead of discovering who you truly are. And this is where your desire for solitude becomes incredibly important, because every time you choose silence over noise, reflection over distraction, presence over performance, you create space for individuation. You create space for your authentic self to emerge. This is why some people feel emotionally nourished after spending time alone. Not lonely, nourished, refreshed, clear, grounded, because their soul finally had room to breathe. Perhaps you experienced this yourself. A day alone, no interruptions, no obligations, no visitors, no need to entertain anyone. And by the end of the day, something feels different. Your thoughts become clearer. Your emotions settle. Problems that seemed overwhelming begin to make sense. Answers emerge naturally, not because you forced them, but because silence created the conditions for them to surface. Jung observed this repeatedly. The unconscious communicates through symbols, dreams, intuition, and insight, but these messages require receptivity. They require stillness. The unconscious cannot compete with constant stimulation. It needs quiet. This is one reason why some people become deeply uncomfortable when their solitude is interrupted, because what looks like an interruption of their schedule may actually feel like an interruption of an important inner process. Imagine someone carefully assembling a puzzle, piece by piece. Everything requires concentration, patience, attention. Now imagine someone repeatedly reaching over and scattering the pieces. Even if they mean well, the process is disrupted. For many introspective people, solitude functions in a similar way. They are unconsciously organizing themselves, processing emotions, integrating experiences, recovering energy, making sense of life. And every interruption requires them to pause that process, to redirect attention outward, to re-engage socially, to leave their inner work unfinished. No wonder unexpected visits can feel exhausting. The visitor sees a simple social interaction. The psyche experiences something much deeper, a disruption of internal alignment. This doesn't mean people are the enemy. Far from it. Jung never advocated permanent isolation. Human connection is essential. Love is essential. Community is essential. But connection becomes healthiest when it emerges from wholeness rather than dependency. And wholeness requires solitude. A person who never spends time alone often becomes dependent on external validation, dependent on approval, dependent on attention, dependent on distraction. But a person who learns to sit comfortably with themselves develops something incredibly powerful, inner stability. They discover that peace does not come from circumstances. It comes from relationship, the relationship they have with themselves. This realization changes everything. Because once you learn to enjoy your own company, loneliness loses much of its power. You no longer need constant stimulation. You no longer fear silence. You no longer panic when plans are canceled. You no longer feel incomplete simply because you are alone. Instead, solitude becomes a resource, a sanctuary, a source of renewal. And perhaps this explains something you felt for years. Perhaps you never disliked people. Perhaps you simply learned that your soul requires silence to function properly. Perhaps your discomfort with constant visitors isn't antisocial behavior. Perhaps it's psychological wisdom. Perhaps your inner self understands something the modern world often forgets. Growth happens in silence. Healing happens in silence. Clarity happens in silence. Transformation happens in silence. And maybe, just maybe, The reason you protect your solitude so fiercely is because some part of you already knows this. Deep down, your soul understands that every time you return to silence, you are returning to yourself. And there is no journey more important than that. The shadow behind your discomfort. Have you ever noticed that not all visitors affect you the same way? Some people enter your home, and everything feels natural. The conversation flows. The atmosphere remains calm. You don't feel pressured. You don't feel drained. In fact, you might even enjoy their presence. But then there are others. People who walk through the same door, sit in the same chair, say ordinary things, and yet, within minutes, something inside you tightens. Your patience becomes shorter. Your energy begins to disappear. An unexplained irritation emerges. And afterward, you find yourself wondering, why did that affect me so much? Why was I so uncomfortable? They didn't even do anything wrong. Carl Jung believed these moments are rarely random. In fact, they may reveal some of the deepest truths about ourselves. Because often, what disturbs us most in other people is not what is happening outside us. It is what is being activated inside us. This brings us to one of Jung's most important discoveries, the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is not darkness in the dramatic sense people often imagine. The shadow is simply the part of yourself that remains unconscious. The aspects you have rejected, the emotions you've suppressed, the qualities you've hidden, the wounds you've avoided, the truths you've never fully faced. Imagine your psyche as a house. Some rooms are brightly lit. You know them well. These are the parts of yourself you openly accept, your strengths, your talents, your socially acceptable traits. But there are other rooms, locked rooms, dark rooms, forgotten rooms, places you avoided entering for years. These rooms contain the shadow, and whether you visit them or not, they remain part of the house. The problem is that what remains unconscious does not stay inactive. It continues influencing your thoughts, your feelings, your reactions, your relationships, often without your awareness. This is why Jung famously said, "What remains unconscious will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Now think about what happens when someone enters your home. They don't simply enter a physical space. They enter an emotional space. And sometimes their presence unknowingly activates something hidden within you. Perhaps they are overly critical. And suddenly you feel defensive, not because of what they said today, but because they unconsciously remind you of criticism you experienced years ago. Perhaps they're demanding, and something inside you immediately resists, not because of the request itself, but because it touches an old wound connected to feeling controlled. Perhaps they talk constantly, never listening, never slowing down, and their presence creates an overwhelming urge to escape. Why? Because they embody a quality your psyche has learned to associate with emotional exhaustion. The conscious mind sees a visitor. The unconscious mind sees a symbol, a trigger, a reflection, a reminder. This is why emotional reactions are often disproportionate. The present moment activates unfinished experiences from past. And suddenly your response becomes much larger than the situation itself. You might think, I just don't like that person. And sometimes that's true, but Jung would encourage a deeper question. What exactly is this person awakening inside me? Because every strong emotional reaction contains information, every irritation, every discomfort, every sudden urge to withdraw. These reactions are messages, and often they point directly toward the shadow. Imagine someone enters your home and immediately begins judging everything. Your choices, your habits, your lifestyle. Perhaps you feel intense anger. The obvious explanation is simple. They're being judgmental. But Jung would ask you to look deeper. Why does their judgment affect you so strongly? Is it because part of you secretly judges yourself? Is it because you've spent years trying to earn approval? Is it because an old wound still exists beneath the surface? The goal isn't self-blame. The goal is awareness, because awareness transforms suffering into understanding, and understanding transforms reaction into growth. This is one of the most powerful gifts of solitude. When you're alone, you have an opportunity to examine these reactions honestly, without distraction, without defensiveness. without needing to protect an image. You can ask yourself, why did that comment upset me? Why did that visit exhaust me? Why did that person make me feel so uncomfortable? And often, if you're willing to sit quietly enough, the answer arrives. Not immediately, but eventually. The unconscious begins to reveal itself. This is exactly why Jung believed solitude was necessary for psychological development, because without solitude, we never have time to process our experiences. We simply move from one interaction to the next, one distraction to the next, one obligation to the next, and the shadow remains hidden. But when you spend time alone, reflecting, observing, listening, the hidden begins to emerge. You start recognizing patterns. You start seeing connections. You start understanding yourself at a deeper level. And something remarkable happens. The people who once irritated you become teachers. The situations that once triggered you become opportunities. The discomfort that once felt meaningless becomes valuable information. This doesn't mean every difficult visitor is secretly helping you. Some people genuinely disrespect boundaries. Some relationships genuinely drain energy. Healthy boundaries remain essential, but Jung's insight goes further. He reminds us that every emotional reaction has two components: what belongs to the other person and what belongs to us. Maturity begins when we learn to distinguish between the two, because once we do, we stop giving away our power. We stop blaming every feeling on the outside world, and we begin understanding the deeper movements of our own psyche. Perhaps this is why your home feels so protective. Inside that space, you are not only protecting your energy, you are protecting a process. The process of self-discovery, the process of becoming conscious, the process of meeting parts of yourself that have been waiting patiently for years to be seen. And every time you choose silence over distraction, reflection over avoidance, awareness over denial, you take another step toward wholeness, not perfection. Wholeness. The goal was never to eliminate the shadow. The goal is to know it, because the moment you become conscious of what once controlled you unconsciously, you become freer. And freedom is one of the greatest gifts psychological growth can offer. The Hermit archetype. Why some souls need distance to find themselves. Imagine an old traveler walking alone through a mountain path at night. No crowd, no applause, no audience. Just a lantern in his hand, and a narrow road stretching into the darkness. To most people, he appears lonely, perhaps even sad. But if you look closer, something else becomes visible. Peace, certainty, wisdom. He is not lost. He knows exactly where he is going. Carl Jung recognized this figure immediately. He called him the Hermit, not merely a person, an archetype, a universal pattern that exists within the human psyche, an ancient energy that awakens whenever a person feels called to withdraw from the noise of the world and reconnect with something deeper. And if you have ever felt a powerful desire to be alone, to protect your space, to avoid unnecessary visitors, to retreat from constant social demands, then the Hermit may already be active within you. Most people misunderstand the Hermit. They assume solitude means sadness. They assume distance means rejection. They assume withdrawal means weakness. But Jung saw something entirely different. He saw solitude as a sacred stage of transformation, because every meaningful transformation requires separation. Think about nature. A seed must disappear beneath the soil before it can grow. A caterpillar must enter the cocoon before it becomes a butterfly. Even the moon disappears into darkness before becoming full again. Growth often begins with retreat, and the human soul is no different. The problem is that modern culture fears retreat. It fears silence. It fears stillness. It fears anyone who steps away from the crowd. From childhood, many of us are taught the same message. Stay connected. Stay visible. Stay available. Stay busy. Always participate. Always engage. Always respond. And if you don't, people begin asking questions. Why are you so quiet? Why don't you go out more? Why do you spend so much time alone? Why don't you invite people over? The assumption is always the same. Something must be wrong. But Jung would challenge that assumption. What if nothing is wrong? What if the soul simply needs something the world no longer values? Depth, Because depth cannot be found in constant activity. Depth requires reflection, and reflection requires solitude. The hermit understands this. That is why he walks away from the crowd. Not because he hates people, not because he feels superior, not because he wants isolation, but because there are questions that can only be answered in silence. Questions such as, who am I when nobody is watching? What do I truly want? What am I avoiding? What needs healing inside me? What kind of life actually belongs to me? These questions cannot be answered through social performance. They require honesty. And honesty becomes much easier when there is nobody around to impress. This is why so many people feel drawn towards solitude during periods of personal growth. The soul instinctively creates distance from distractions, not permanently, temporarily, long enough to hear itself again. Have you ever noticed how your deepest insights often arrive when you're alone? Perhaps during a walk, perhaps late at night, perhaps sitting quietly with a cup of coffee while the rest of the world sleeps. Suddenly something becomes clear, a decision, a truth, a realization, a direction. The answer wasn't created in that moment. It was already inside you. Silence simply allowed you to hear it. That is the gift of the hermit. He teaches you that wisdom is not always found by gathering more information. Sometimes wisdom appears when you stop consuming and start listening. Listening to your intuition, listening to your emotions, listening to your dreams, listening to the quiet voice beneath all the noise. Jung believed that every archetype carries both gifts and dangers. The hermit is no exception. His gift is wisdom. His danger is isolation. Because there is a difference between sacred solitude and emotional withdrawal. The hermit withdraws to reconnect. The wounded person withdraws to escape. One creates growth. The other creates stagnation. This distinction matters. The goal is never to hide from life. The goal is to understand life more deeply. A healthy hermit eventually returns. He comes back carrying insight, clarity, self-knowledge, strength. He returns not because he needs the world approval, but because he has discovered something valuable within himself. And now he can relate to others from a place of wholeness instead of need. Perhaps this explains something you felt for years. Maybe your resistance to visitors is not about disliking people. Maybe it's about protecting an important psychological process. Maybe part of you understands that your solitude serves a purpose, that every quiet evening, every protected boundary, every peaceful moment alone allows something valuable to grow. Your awareness, your emotional balance, your understanding of yourself, your relationship with your own soul. And that growth is precious, far too precious to sacrifice simply because other people don't understand it. The hermit teaches one final lesson, a lesson our culture desperately needs. He reminds us that being alone and being lonely are not the same thing. Loneliness is the pain of disconnection. Solitude is the joy of connection with oneself. One feels empty, the other feels full. One creates suffering, the other creates renewal. Many people spend their lives surrounded by others and still feel lonely, and many others spend time alone and feel completely at peace. The difference is not the number of people around them. The difference is the quality of the relationship they have with themselves. And perhaps that is why your home matters so much. Perhaps that is why silence feels sacred. Perhaps that is why unexpected visitors can feel disruptive. Because your soul has already discovered something profound. It has discovered that solitude is not the absence of life. Sometimes it is where life truly begins. The sixth sign to your soul is asking for more solitude. What if your exhaustion isn't really exhaustion? What if your irritation isn't actually irritation? What if your resistance to visitors isn't rudeness? What if all of these feelings are messages? Messages from a deeper part of yourself trying to get your attention. Carl Jung believed that the psyche is constantly communicating, not through words, but through emotions, through dreams, through discomfort, through patterns. And one of the most common messages the psyche sends is this: slow down, return to yourself. The problem is that most people ignore the message. They keep saying yes when they want to say no. They keep opening doors they want to keep closed. They keep giving energy they no longer have, until eventually their soul begins speaking louder. So let's explore 6 signs that your inner world may be asking for more solitude, not isolation, not escape, healthy solitude, the kind that restores you, the kind that reconnects you to yourself. Small social interactions feel surprisingly exhausting. Have you ever finished a simple conversation and felt strangely drained? Not a conflict, not an argument, just a normal interaction. Yet afterward you feel as if your battery has been depleted. Many people ignore the signal. They assume they're lazy, moody, antisocial. But Jung would suggest another possibility. Your psychic energy may simply be running low. Imagine a phone operating with only 10% battery. Even small tasks suddenly become difficult. The same happens psychologically. When you spend too much time giving attention outward, your inner resources become depleted. And the first symptom is often exhaustion after ordinary interactions. Your soul isn't rejecting people. It's asking for recovery. You feel relief when plans are canceled. Be honest. Have you ever agreed to something only to secretly feel relieved when it got canceled? You immediately feel guilty. You tell yourself, I should be disappointed. But instead you feel lighter, freer, more peaceful. Why? Because a part of you desperately needed space. Jung observed that people often ignore their real needs because they fear disappointing others. But the unconscious keeps score. It knows when you're overextended. It knows when you're living beyond your emotional capacity. And sometimes canceled plans feel like freedom because they restore balance. Not because you dislike people, but because you've been disconnected from yourself for too long. Noise feels more painful than it used to. Something interesting happens during periods of psychological growth. Sensitivity increases. You begin noticing things you once ignored. Crowded environments, constant notifications, television noise, background conversations, interruptions. Suddenly everything feels louder, more intrusive, more exhausting. This isn't necessarily a problem. In fact, Jung might see it as a sign of increased awareness. Your psyche is becoming more selective, less interested in stimulation, more interested in meaning. The soul begins craving depth instead of noise. And when that happens, silence becomes nourishment. You find yourself withdrawing without knowing why. Sometimes people notice a strange impulse. They stop answering messages immediately. They decline invitations. They spend more evenings alone. And they don't fully understand why. The world often labels this behavior negatively. But Jung recognized something important. Many periods of withdrawal are not signs of dysfunction. They are signs of transformation. The psyche naturally retreats when significant inner work is taking place. Just as a wound needs time to heal, the soul sometimes needs distance to integrate change. This is especially true during periods of emotional growth. The withdrawal isn't the problem. Ignoring its purpose might be. You crave depth and feel drained by surface-level conversations. One of the clearest signs your soul needs solitude is this. You become increasingly intolerant of superficiality. Small talk feels exhausting. Endless gossip feels empty. Meaningless conversations leave you depleted. Not because you're arrogant, not because you think you're better than anyone, but because something inside you is seeking substance. Jung believed that psychological maturity naturally creates a hunger for authenticity. You begin wanting conversations that matter. Conversations about life, meaning, growth, truth, purpose. And when those conversations are absent, solitude often feels more nourishing than company. Not because you're rejecting connection, but because you're seeking real connection. Your inner world feels more interesting than the outer world. This final sign surprises many people. You begin enjoying your own company, not tolerating it, enjoying it. You look forward to quiet mornings, peaceful evenings, long walks, reading, reflection, journaling, thinking, dreaming. For the first time, being alone doesn't feel empty. It feels rich, alive, meaningful. And this is often a sign that something beautiful is happening. Your relationship with yourself is deepening. Jung believed this relationship is the foundation of psychological wholeness, because a person who enjoys their own company becomes less dependent on external validation, less dependent on approval, less dependent on constant attention, more grounded, more stable. more free, and freedom is exactly what individuation creates. What these 6 signs really mean. Now, let's be clear. These signs do not mean you should isolate yourself from the world. That is not what Jung taught. The goal is not withdrawal from life. The goal is alignment with life. But alignment becomes impossible when you constantly ignore your inner needs. Think of solitude as emotional nutrition. Just as the body requires rest, the psyche requires silence. Just as muscles need recovery, the soul needs space. Just as nature moves through seasons, human beings move through seasons too. And perhaps you are entering a season that requires more reflection, more stillness, more connection with yourself. If so, there is nothing wrong with you. In fact, there may be something very right happening, because the people who eventually discover who they truly are almost always spend time alone first. They learn to listen, to observe, to reflect, to become intimate with their own inner world. And once that relationship is established, everything changes. Relationships become healthier, boundaries become stronger, decisions become clearer, life becomes more authentic, not because the world changed, but because they did. And perhaps that is what your soul has been trying to tell you all along. The discomfort, the exhaustion, the desire for silence, the need for space. None of it was weakness. It was guidance, a quiet invitation to come home to yourself. How to protect your energy without feeling guilty. Have you ever said yes when every part of you wanted to say no? A friend wants to stop by. A relative announces a visit. Someone asks for your time, your attention, your energy, and immediately you feel resistance. But instead of listening to that feeling, you ignore it. You smile. You agree. You make yourself available. And afterward, you feel drained, frustrated, and strangely angry, not at the other person, at yourself. Because deep down, you know what happened. You abandoned yourself. Again, this is one of the most common psychological patterns Jung observed. People spend so much energy adapting to others that they lose contact with their own needs. They become experts at pleasing everyone except themselves. And over time, this creates an invisible wound, a wound called self-betrayal. The tragedy is that most people don't even recognize it. They believe they're being kind, generous, helpful, selfless. But there's a profound difference between kindness and self-abandonment. Kindness comes from choice. Self-abandonment comes from fear. Fear of rejection, fear of disappointing others, fear of being judged, fear of appearing selfish. And this fear silently controls countless lives. Think about how often people violate their own boundaries, not because they want to, because they feel obligated. They answer calls they don't want to answer, attend events they don't want to attend, host people they don't want to host, agree to things they don't have the energy for. Then they wonder why they feel exhausted. The answer is simple. Every time you ignore your own truth, your soul pays a price. Jung believed that psychological health depends on alignment. Alignment between what you feel and how you live. Alignment between your inner world and your outer actions. When those two realities become disconnected, suffering appears. And nowhere is this more obvious than with personal boundaries. Because boundaries are not walls. They are truths. They are the physical expression of self-respect. A boundary simply says, this is what I can give. This is what I cannot give. This is what nourishes me. This is what depletes me. This is where I end and someone else begins. Yet many people treat boundaries as if they are acts of aggression. They feel guilty for saying no, guilty for needing space, guilty for wanting solitude, guilty for protecting their peace. But why? Why should peace require an apology? Why should self-care feel selfish? The answer often lies in conditioning. Many of us were taught that being good means being available, always, that being loving means sacrificing ourselves, that being kind means never disappointing anyone. But Jung understood something important. A person who constantly sacrifices themselves eventually has nothing left to give, because true generosity can only come from fullness, not depletion. Imagine a well. If water is constantly taken from it without replenishment, eventually it runs dry. Human beings are no different. Your energy must be renewed. Your emotional reserves must be restored. Your soul must be nourished. Otherwise, even the simplest interactions become burdens. This is why solitude is not selfish. It is maintenance, necessary maintenance. The same way sleep restores the body, solitude restores the self. And yet guilt often appears the moment we try to protect it. Someone becomes disappointed. Someone takes it personally. Someone says, "You've changed. You're distant. You never come around anymore. You always want to be alone." And suddenly the old fear returns. The fear of being misunderstood. The fear of not being liked. The fear of being judged. But here's something worth remembering. The people who benefit most from your lack of boundaries are often the people least interested in respecting them. Jung frequently spoke about the importance of individuation, the process of becoming your authentic self. But authenticity comes with a cost. Not everyone will understand you. Not everyone will approve. Not everyone will like the person you become when you stop living for their expectations. And that is okay, because individuation was never about becoming acceptable. It was about becoming real. Real people have limits. Real people need rest. Real people require solitude. Real people cannot be endlessly available. The mature soul understands this. The immature soul resents it. This is why learning to say no becomes one of the most important psychological skills you can develop. Not a harsh no, not an angry no, a peaceful no, a clear no, a truthful no, the kind of no that doesn't come from hostility, but from self-awareness. You don't need elaborate explanations. You don't need endless justifications. You don't need to convince everyone. Sometimes a simple sentence is enough. Not today. I need some time for myself. I'm staying in tonight. I need some quiet time. The people who truly care about you may not always understand, but they will respect it. And those who refuse to respect it reveal something important about themselves, not about you. There is a remarkable freedom that appears when you stop apologizing for your needs, a freedom many people never experience. For the first time, your decisions begin aligning with your truth. You stop living reactively. You stop living for approval. You stop organizing your life around other people's comfort. And something unexpected happens. Your relationships improve because resentment disappears. Authenticity grows. Connection becomes genuine instead of forced. You spend time with people because you choose to, not because you feel trapped, not because you feel guilty, not because you're afraid of disappointing them. This creates healthier relationships for everyone involved, because authentic presence is infinitely more valuable than reluctant presence. Think about that. Would you rather spend time with someone who genuinely wants to be there, or someone who feels obligated? Most people know the answer immediately. Yet they rarely apply that same wisdom to themselves. The truth is simple. Your soul cannot thrive in an environment where its needs are constantly ignored. And perhaps that is why your discomfort with visitors exists. Not to isolate you, not to separate you from people, but to teach you something essential. To teach you how to honor your limits. To teach you how to value your peace. To teach you how to listen to yourself. Because every healthy relationship begins with the relationship you have with yourself. And if you cannot respect your own needs, no one else will learn to respect them either. The moment you stop abandoning yourself to keep others comfortable, a new chapter begins. A chapter built on authenticity. A chapter built on self-respect. A chapter built on peace. And peace is far too valuable to sacrifice simply because someone expects access to your energy. Your peace matters. Your space matters. Your solitude matters. And most importantly, you matter. The real reason you don't like visitors, and why there is nothing wrong with you. Maybe you spent years wondering whether something was wrong with you. Maybe you watched other people effortlessly welcome guests, host gatherings, keep their doors open, and thrive in constant company. And maybe, somewhere deep inside, you've quietly asked yourself, why am I different? Why do I feel relieved when people leave? Why do I need so much time alone? Why does my own home feel so sacred to me? If you've carried those questions for years, Carl Jung's answer may surprise you. Because according to Jung, the problem is not that you need solitude. The problem is that you were taught to distrust it. From an early age, most of us are conditioned to believe that sociability is a virtue. The more outgoing you are, the healthier you appear. The more available you are, the more lovable you seem. The more people surround you, the more successful your life appears. And because of that, countless people learn to ignore their own nature. They force themselves into environments that drain them. They suppress their need for silence. They betray their instincts. They become strangers to themselves. And over time, something inside begins to suffer, not because they are alone, because they are disconnected. Disconnected from their own truth, disconnected from their own rhythm, disconnected from their own soul. Jung spent his entire life exploring one central question: how does a person become fully themselves? His answer was individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming who you truly are. And here's the part most people miss. Individuation does not make everyone the same. It reveals how different we truly are. Some people flourish through constant interaction. Others flourish through reflection. Some people discover themselves in crowds. Others discover themselves in silence. Neither path is superior. Neither path is defective. They are simply different expressions of human nature. The tragedy begins when we try to force one path onto everyone. When introverts are taught to behave like extroverts. When sensitive souls are told they are too sensitive. When reflective people are told they think too much. When those who need solitude are made to feel guilty for it. This guilt creates an unnecessary battle. A battle between who you are and who you think you're supposed to be. And that battle can last decades. But what if you stop fighting? What if your desire for solitude isn't a flaw? What if it is wisdom? What if the discomfort you feel when people invade your space isn't dysfunction? What if it's intelligence? Not intellectual intelligence. Psychological intelligence. The intelligence of a psyche that knows its own limits. The intelligence of a soul that understands what it needs. Because the truth is this: not everyone who enjoys being alone is lonely, and not everyone surrounded by people feels connected. Jung understood that loneliness and solitude are not the same thing. Loneliness is disconnection. Solitude is connection. Loneliness is feeling abandoned. Solitude is feeling present. Loneliness hurts because something is missing. Solitude heals because something is found. And perhaps what you've been finding all these years is yourself. Every quiet evening, every canceled plan, every peaceful weekend, every moment spent reading, reflecting, thinking, walking, or simply sitting in silence. These moments were not empty. They were sacred, because while the world was demanding your attention, your soul was asking for your presence. And finally, perhaps you're beginning to listen. Think about everything we've explored together. The introvert, the shadow, the persona, the house as a symbol of the self, the hermit, boundaries, individuation. At first, these ideas may have seemed separate, but now you can see they are all pointing toward the same truth. Your discomfort with visitors is rarely about visitors. It is about protecting something valuable. Your energy, your attention, your authenticity, your inner life, your relationship with yourself. When someone enters your home, they are not merely entering a building. They are entering the environment where your psyche restores itself. And for some people, that space is profoundly important. Not because they hate people, not because they are antisocial, not because they are broken, but because they understand something many people forget. Your inner world deserves protection. In a culture obsessed with constant stimulation, silence becomes revolutionary. In a culture obsessed with visibility, privacy becomes powerful. In a culture obsessed with external validation, self-connection becomes an act of courage. And perhaps that is the real message hidden beneath your desire for solitude. You are not withdrawing from life. You are returning to yourself. You are not rejecting connection. You are seeking a deeper form of it. You are not hiding. You are listening. Listening to a voice most people spend their lives trying to drown out. The voice of the soul. Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are, not who others expect, not who society rewards, not who your fears demand, who you truly are. And maybe becoming that person requires more silence than the world understands. Maybe it requires closing some doors. Maybe it requires disappointing some expectations. Maybe it requires spending more evenings alone than others think is normal. That's okay, because your path was never meant to look like everyone else's. It was meant to look like yours. So the next time someone questions your need for solitude, the next time you feel guilty for wanting a quiet evening, the next time you hesitate before protecting your peace, remember this. There is nothing wrong with you. You are not cold. You are not selfish. You are not antisocial. You are not broken. You are simply learning one of life's deepest lessons. That peace is precious. That energy is finite. That authenticity matters. And that the relationship you build with yourself becomes a foundation for every other relationship in your life. Honor that relationship. Protect it. Nurture it. Listen to it. Because when you learn to enjoy your own company, something remarkable happens. You stop begging the world to complete you. You stop fearing solitude. You stop running from silence. And for the first time, you discover that being alone and being whole can become the very same thing. If this message resonated with you, take a moment and share in the comments. Do unexpected visitors drain your energy, or do they energize you? Your experience may help someone else realize they are not alone. And if this journey spoke to something deep within you, subscribe and join us for more explorations into Carl Jung, psychology, self-discovery, and the hidden wisdom of the soul. Until next time, protect your peace, trust your nature, and never apologize for the way your soul was designed.